Chapter 9. The Waterfall. Rick, grandfather, and I had been heading back to camp on a trail that we called Drudgery. We began our journey long before sunrise and had walked through the better part of the day. It was mid-August. The temperatures were well into the 90s. The air was still and heavy with humidity. The entire dusty route was without water, and since we carried none, by mid-afternoon our throats were parched and our lips were cracked. The sun burned down, torturing and drying our flesh, and the dust rose in columns behind us, choking us with each step. All Rick and I could think about and talk about was getting to water. Eventually, we could not even talk anymore, such was the dryness of our throats. As I dragged along, I could almost envision the stream that ran through our camp. That would be the first water we would come to in over 14 hours, and it would be a soothing relief. I imagined what it would be like to plunge in, swimming and drinking at the same time, as I had done so many times before. My pace became a crawl as I dragged my feet and intensified the dust plumes. I also began to trip frequently, and a few times actually stumbled to the ground. Each time it became harder to get back up and face the trail again. It was not so much the fatigue that I felt due to the deep sands, but the intense thirst that made the trip so difficult. Several times I hallucinated water. Sometimes I could feel it in the air. Other times I could faintly hear it running. And once I thought I could actually see the water far up ahead. Consciously, I knew that there was no water along the trail, and it became a struggle between reality and hallucination each time the sense of water filtered into my mind. I could tell that Rick was as bad off as I was. Neither of us looked around or smiled. There was no conversation, and each of us seemed wrapped up in our own little thirsty vacuum of dust. Not so with grandfather. He would pause frequently to study a track, a flower, or a feeding bird. The smile never left his face, and he seemed to enjoy every moment, apparently free of thirst. It became exasperating to us every time he stopped, for we too had to stop, which would only prolong our agony and eventual arrival at the water. Grandfather's pace was not even slowed in the least, and with each passing mile he seemed to gain more energy rather than lose it as we were doing. I imagined he was somehow being sustained by the very landscape itself, thriving on that which only brought us thirst. In a way, his attitude and buoyancy made me feel a bit angry, not at him, but at myself. As we drew closer to our camp area and the eventual soothing and quenching properties of the stream, our pace quickened. Though we still dragged our feet and stumbled, our focus on the stream seemed to carry us along. As we entered the camp trail, our stumbling walk shifted into a brisk walk, then a run, and finally a sprint. It became a race against thirst, as if we could outrun it and lose it in the water. We ran right through camp without even a break in the stride, down to the stream, and finally plunging lustily into the cool and refreshing water. Even as I dove beneath the surface, I began to drink. Holding my breath as long as I could, I gobbled down huge mouthfuls. Rick and I then lay back in the water, imagining our bodies hissing like the sound that water makes when it hits the hot rocks in a sweat lodge. It did not take long for the thirst to become a distant memory as our strength and energy began to return. Rick and I lay back at the edge of the stream, our heads resting on the shore and our bodies still submerged in the water. As I lay there, I watched grandfather walking leisurely down the trail, stopping every so often to study some unknown mystery. He was not at all in a hurry, but rather took his time. To someone who did not know any better, they would have never known that he had just finished the same long trek that we had. He seemed so totally unaffected by the whole trip, the intense thirst, or the need to get to the water as we had. To him, it appeared, it was just another stroll, a leisurely walk where neither water nor heat was a factor at all. He just looked so serene and unhurried that he made me angry at myself again. I imagined all of the wondrous things that I had overlooked because of the intense thirst that had clouded my consciousness and perception. Grandfather approached the stream as he always did, smiling at me and Rick, then finally turning his full attention to the water. He paused for a long time and gazed into its depths. His attitude was one of prayer, of thanksgiving, of rapture. At no time did he seem in a hurry to drink. Instead, he took his time, where every action seemed to be so slow and deliberate. Finally, he stooped and touched the water, eventually stroking its surface, all the while in passionate prayer. It was a long time before his hands finally cupped the water and he drank, savoring each mouthful much like a wine taster savors a vintage wine. His action never ceased to amaze Rick or me, even though Grandfather went through it every time he approached water to drink. It made little difference to Grandfather, the intensity of his thirst, for there was always the prayer of thanksgiving and the impassioned touching of the waters, yet the ritual always seemed to be prolonged during the times of extreme thirst. Anyone who saw him would immediately see and feel the intensity of Grandfather's sense of thanksgiving and awe. So, too, would anyone who bore witness to this act be held in awe. Rick and I just turned to each other and smiled in a knowing way. A kind of knowing without fully knowing, for we could only vaguely understand the driving force that directed Grandfather's actions. Rick and I spent much of the day and early evening in and around the water. Water for me was always a source of tranquility, a meditation, where I can think more clearly and deeply. It always tends to cleanse the body and spirit, intensifying spiritual thoughts. This day was no exception. I thought about many things, but most of all I thought about Grandfather's approach to the water. Even though he had given me numerous explanations on numerous occasions, I still felt that he was holding something back. There always seemed to be a piece of the puzzle missing, and without that missing piece, I could not fully understand his actions and deep sense of thanksgiving. I could sense in a way that it went far beyond the parameters of thanksgiving, and it was what lay beyond that I fully wanted to understand. I became determined to find the answer as soon as the opportunity arose. After dark, Grandfather, Rick, and I sat around the campfire and talked about our long journey. Both Rick and I talked of the intense thirst and how it had obliterated all else. We also told Grandfather how disappointed we were that we gave in to the negative effects of the thirst and how we wished that we were more like him. He simply told us that we had given the thirst far too much power over us, and it was this power that cut us off from the beauties found all along our walk. Without hesitation, I asked Grandfather if he was not also thirsty and why he always took his time, even in times of dire thirst, before he would drink the water. Grandfather then told me again that it was in reverence and thanksgiving that he approached the water in this way, just as he had always explained it to me. But this time I told him I thought there had to be much more to it than that. I felt there was something that he was leaving out, whether by accident or on purpose, and I wanted to know why. He looked at Rick and me for a long time, then finally told us the story of the waterfall, which forever changed his perception of life. It was during Grandfather's last visit to South America that he was taught one of the most profound lessons of his life by this waterfall. He was visiting an old shaman that he had visited many times before when he was told of the waterfall, which this old man simply called life. Grandfather was told that the waterfall was deep in the jungle and that the journey to the base would take several days. The old shaman told Grandfather that the waterfall must be approached alone. Thus he could only point the direction and not lead him there. He told Grandfather that only those who walk a spiritual path could find this waterfall. All others would perish on the perilous journey through the jungle. Grandfather began his journey to the waterfall on the following morning, using the shaman's directions and his own inner vision to guide him. The jungle was thick and trackless at this point, for the old shaman lived alone, far from the village, and his shelter was located on the outskirts of the encampment. There were no trails beyond his shelter, and the trees were so thick and the underbrush so overgrown that he could hardly see the sun at all. There were no natural features to give him a sense of direction, and he found that he had to rely solely on his inner vision to guide him. At times, he found that even in the middle of the day, much of his journey was in deep green darkness. It was a tough journey, for Grandfather did not want to kill any plants or break them out of his way. Thus he crawled under or walked around the thicker stands of vegetation, which only made his journey longer and completely obscured his sense of direction. The nights were even worse than the days. His determination to find the waterfall of life was so strong that many times he would travel through the night, resting only when he could not physically go on. He felt that the journey had to be undertaken with this kind of drive so as to show the spirits and the waterfall that he was truly worthy to be on such a quest. So too at times did he know that he was truly lost. Not only was he unsure as to where he was, but he could not get back to the old shaman without the use of his inner vision. His inner vision was all that he had, and he had to trust it fully, casting out all logical doubt and giving himself over completely to his spiritual mind. The journey took many days, but he did not remember how many. He said that the days and nights were fused together in a random sort of a way where it made little difference to him if it were day or night or even how long the journey would take. All he knew was that he had to get to the waterfall or die trying. He had no fear, for he knew that the jungle, like any other wilderness, was still part of the earth and that it would take care of him. To him, it was a home. For that matter, any wild place was his home. Though he wanted desperately to get to the waterfall, he took the time to study and communicate with the various plants and animals along the way. There was no rush, never a rush. He studied the landscape, searching out its secrets. He found no evidence of human travel. Most of the trails were made from small animals, which would not allow for easy human access. Even when he dug beneath the layers of loam, there was no sign of human footprints, even in the more open areas. Grandfather had shown us long ago how to carefully dig through the forest litter and reveal tracks that had been hidden from the deteriorating effects of weather, some of which could be dated back many years. So when Grandfather told us that he had no evidence of human travel, we could be assured that no one had passed through that part of the jungle. He sensed that he was one of the only humans to walk through this area. He imagined then what it felt like for the first man to ever walk upon the earth. Grandfather remembered that for the last 2 days and nights of his journey, the landscape began to change. It was no longer flat jungle, and now he continuously began to climb higher and higher as he approached some unseen mountain range. The jungle was still too thick to see any distant change, but he could feel the elevation changes with each passing mile. Soon large moss and fern-covered boulders began to appear in the jungle, small at first, but growing larger as he climbed higher and higher. Even the vegetation began to change as new plants and animals began to appear, and the familiar ones began to grow uncommon. As he traveled, he sensed a deeper change, deeper than just the elevation of the jungle. There was something more, a power that he could not describe, but a power that seemed to beckon him, directing his every move. At first he could not place its origin. Even his inner vision failed him, and this sense of unknowing followed him through much of the last day and night. It was nearing dawn on his final day of travel when he realized that it was the powerful presence of the waterfall that was calling him. It was nothing he heard or saw that brought him to this realization, just a sense of knowing that the waterfall called life was luring him. As he traveled, now pulled by the power of the waterfall, his trek became easier. It was almost as if he were being guided solely by his spiritual mind, where his body fell away and became non-existent. The farther he traveled, the easier became the route. At times he felt as if he were floating rather than walking, to a point where there was no longer any fatigue. The closer he got, the clearer and more expansive his mind became, to a point where he could actually see the waterfall in his mind and feel it moving within his body. The power and the sound of the waterfall could now be felt on a physical level, even though he was still quite some distance away. This power and sound began as a low vibration and gradually intensified as he drew nearer to the falls. He could still not see the waterfall, for the jungle remained thick, and it was impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. At times the sound, the vibration, and power grew so intense that he felt like the waterfall was all around him. At those times he had to stop and reorient himself to the call of the waters. The jungle seemed damper at this point, and the vegetation lusher and healthier than it had been on the beginning of the trip. As the sound of the waterfall intensified, so too did the lushness of the vegetation. It seemed to him that the plants were feeding on the fall's energy, growing healthier and stronger with their close proximity to the energy of the waterfall. Still, there was no visual sighting, just the ever-increasing sound and intensity of the falling water. With each step closer to the waterfall, the vibration, energy, and power increased, almost thundering at times. The very earth, rocks, and trees seemed to tremble as he touched them, and soon even the leaves of the plants seemed to quiver. At times the quivering earth and thunderous sound was frightening, yet at the same time energizing and soothing. Finally, Grandfather reached the stream and began following it upwards. The stream was quite deep, yet slow-moving and wide, quite unexpected since the waterfall still sounded powerful, and he had suspected that the stream would run wild and thunderous. As he moved up along the stream, he noticed that he was entering a deep gorge, yet he could not see very far up ahead. Such was the thickness of the trees and low vegetation. As he moved deeper into the gorge, he noticed that the trees were healthier and larger than anything he had yet encountered. Here the very earth vibrated with the thunderous sound, trembling as if it were made of flesh. His pulse quickened as he moved forward, anticipating that at any moment the falls would come into full view. Finally, as he rounded the last bend in the stream, the waterfall came into full view. He was so awestruck by its magnificence that he almost lost his balance and fell into the stream. The waterfall poured down the mountain of green, slicing into the jungle like a silver ribbon. From the upper part of the mountain, at least as far as the eye could see, the stream danced across boulders in a wild frenzy. It collected in deep pools midway up the mountain, then poured over the lip in a straight drop. It was wide at the top to the midway point, where it funneled through a thick rock outcropping, exploding to a thunderous mass of spray that rained down into the basal pool. Here the waters boiled, then stilled, as they continued down the lower stream. He had seen larger and grander falls in his life, but there was something about this one that captivated his spirit. Right away he felt a deep kinship with the falls, as if it had been speaking to him all along. What's more was that it was just as he had envisioned it to be, when the old shaman spoke of its existence. So, too, did he realize that this falls was very sacred, and he stood trembling, like the earth and trees in this temple of water. As soon as he saw the falls, he felt pure and free of all thought, and his body and spirit felt cleansed and awake. He shook with anticipation, as if waiting for the falls to reveal its wisdom. After he composed himself, he searched for a place to sit and wait for the waterfall to speak. The trembling never left him, such was the power of the waterfall and his anticipation. As he moved closer to the base of the falls, the rockscape became slippery and treacherous. Each step had to be planned before he even attempted to move. It took him hours to move even a short distance, and by the time he reached the base of the falls, it was late afternoon. He found a boulder that rose above the boiling spray of the waterfall, and here he decided to sit. It was like an island, sticking out of the mist, and the upper part was dry. It would afford a good view of the entire falls. To him, it was as if he were seated on an altar. It was not his intention to undertake a vision quest, for there was no questing needed. Instead, he sat and waited for the waterfall to speak to him, much like a child waits for an elder to speak. He believed that the actual questing took place on the long journey to the falls, and now all he had to do was to humbly wait. At this point, he did not care if the waterfall communicated to him at all. He felt blessed just by being in its powerful presence. To him, just being there was enough, and from being there, he felt fulfilled and pure. Those were gifts enough. Grandfather sat at the base of the waterfall all night, never leaving the boulder altar. He could not sleep, but drifted in and out of a dream-like stupor. Many times his mind would wander back in time, paradoxically, to those times in his life when he was in the desert. Several times he relived the times of his life when he almost died of thirst, and at that point of pain, the thundering of the waterfall would yank him back to reality. He did not know why he thought so often of the thirsty memories, but they came freely and without warning. He imagined that somehow the waterfall was causing the memories to surface, but he did not know how or why. Any other thoughts seemed random and out of place, which soon returned to thoughts of the arid places and extreme thirst. Dawn was a gorgeous mix of light and shadow that made the waterfall appear as a solid column of water rather than thundering spray. The falls seemed, at this point, to stand out in bold relief from the darkened rock face, appearing even more so as a living entity. In a way, this now living fall shocked him. Certainly he knew that the water had a spirit all of its own, but this falls was more than spirit. It was now flesh to him. As he gazed at the falls, there was no doubt in his mind that it was alive. Not only alive, but had a mind of its own. It was a collective consciousness of every drop and fragment of spray coming together to form the living mind of the waterfall. It was no longer the blood of Earth Mother, but now a living, thinking being. He trembled at the thought of being in the presence of such a deity. To him, it was a sudden enlightenment to realize that the water was not just spirit, but a living entity. He reveled in the thought. The waterfall had taught him what was to be the first of many lessons. Truly, Grandfather said that he thought this must be why the old shaman had called the waterfall life. For Grandfather had now seen the waters come to life. Transcending what he once thought only to be spirit, now was flesh and mind. It was alive in every sense of the word, not just imagination, but in stark reality, for the mind of the waters had fused with Grandfather's very soul, and the communication was profound indeed. It was more than any human lips could ever convey. All day long and into the late afternoon, Grandfather kept his vigil on the boulder altar. Though there was no further communication for most of the day, Grandfather had enough to do just trying to digest what he had already learned. Every time he thought of the living waterfall, shivers of excitement and gratitude ran up his spine. During the late afternoon, Grandfather began to question why this waterfall had hit him so powerfully and seemed so alive. Certainly he had stood before many waterfalls before, but none had communicated to him in such a living way. There was always a communication on a spiritual level, but this fall seemed so alive and definitely had a mind of its own. He wondered if, in fact, all waterfalls were like this one. It may have been that he was just too blind to see the truth before. He began to think about how all the drops of water and spray combined to make this living waterfall, and how surely they fused together all the streams before and after the falls into one consciousness. It was like the collective consciousness of countless parts that made the whole, the grand consciousness, the mind of the waterfall. But where does that collective consciousness begin and where does it end? Is the mind only in this waterfall? Or is it in all waterfalls, all waters, and all oceans? Could it be, he wondered, that the consciousness of all the waterfalls, the streams, lakes, rivers, and oceans combined to make up a grander consciousness, the greater flesh and mind of all waters? After all water is connected. Even the water of his flesh is connected to all waters of earth and sky. The sudden realization came over Grandfather that it was not the mind of this particular waterfall. It was not its life solely, but the combination of all waters. This waterfall was a doorway to all other waters, and it was all the waters of the earth that Grandfather had communicated with on a living, thinking level. The mere thought of all of this had made Grandfather's head spin. It was all so overwhelming. Through this waterfall, through any water, Grandfather could communicate with all waters of the world, even the waters that pulse through the veins of man, animal, plant, and even the rains in the sky. Water then was not just a spiritual entity, but a living, breathing, and thinking being. Grandfather grew tired from the overload of knowledge and began to slip into a place somewhere between sleep and reality. He wondered to himself if he were not just projecting his own thoughts onto that of the water. But then, he thought, our bodies and minds are composed mostly of water. Is it not then that the water is projecting thoughts unto itself, using what we consider to be our minds as a vehicle? Are our thoughts really our own, he thought, or are they a combination of many entities, most of which are water? And at what point, he questioned, do the waters taken into our bodies become living tissue, living brain, our mind? Could the inverse be true? That it is not our thoughts projected to the waters, but the waters projecting their consciousness to us? These questions overwhelmed Grandfather, and he fell into a deep and much-needed sleep. He fell into a deep dream or vision. He did not know which, but the journey seemed so real. He dreamed that he was floating in a vast sea where no land was visible. He did not feel threatened or afraid of its vastness. Instead, he felt at peace, part of the whole, and not separate in any way. At times he could not feel where his flesh ended and the waters of the sea began. Instead, he felt expanded, where his reality reached from shore to shore and touched the very sky. His flesh was that of the ocean, and his mind was that of all waters. In one instance, he was all waters, and yet at the same time he could still feel his own identity. Still firmly locked into this dream or vision, he was then lifted from the oceans and began soaring on the back of an eagle. He flew across the waters and a distant land. There he was taken to a waterfall, and through that waterfall, like a window, he was instantly connected to all the waters of the earth and sky. He was then taken to a stream, a pond, a river, and a swamp, where there again he felt the connection to all waters. Then he flew to the mountains and gazed down on the snows, the ice, the glaciers, and again he felt the connection, the mind of all waters. Finally he was taken deep into the cloudy sky, then to the dew-drenched plains, and then to the damp, loamy forests where he again felt all waters. Finally he was flown back to the boulder altar, and as he looked into the eye of the eagle, he again was part of all waters. The eagle handed him a pottery cup filled with water, and as he drank, he became all water. He awoke to the thunderous roar of the waterfall. Many questions had been answered in his dream, but he did not know how. He had learned in a very profound way that any water was like a window through which one could be connected to all waters of the world, no matter what form they took. So too he began to understand the mind and the consciousness of the living waters. He understood fully when the waters became living. It was not when the waters entered a plant, a tree, an animal, or man that they became living tissue, for he knew that water in and of itself is a living, thinking entity. It is always living, but its life can only be seen by those who understand first its spirit. At this point, he was overwhelmed by all that he had learned of the living waters, but he felt that there was more, much more. Every time he thought of leaving throughout the day, the waterfall would not allow him to leave. In fact, every time that he thought of anything other than what the water had thus far taught him, he was pulled back to the thoughts of living water by the thunder of the waterfall. It was like the waterfall wanted him to do nothing else but to make clear in his mind all that he had learned and make it part of his reality. This process went on through the day and well into the evening hours. It was only at sunset that Grandfather became exhausted by all of the analysis, and he was finally allowed to relax, as if the waterfall said that it was enough for right now. There was a silence throughout the night, not a physical silence, but a silence in further communication with the waterfall. He fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, awakening refreshed at dawn. Again, the trembling feeling of anticipation struck him deeply, and he knew that he was about to learn more. Yet as he looked at the waterfall, he somehow knew that it would not be from the waters this time. This baffled him in a way, for he expected that the waterfall would teach him and again become that window to all waters. But there was nothing but a spiritual silence. Only the anticipation remained as he searched the waterfall for answers. His attention shifted from the water, and he began to gaze at the rock walls that surrounded the waterfall. They were dark and very wet, constantly bathed in the mists of falling water. Strewn randomly across the rocks were patches of ferns, mosses, and other vegetation, sparse nearest to the falling water, but carpeting the rocks further away. The steep rock walls and the vegetation began to capture Grandfather's imagination with the same intensity that he had felt the day before while gazing at the waterfall. Somehow, he then knew that the rocks had something to teach him as he felt the beckoning power that the waters had used, now pulling his concentration toward the rocks. He watched the various birds and small mammals feeding on and around the rock boulders and cliffs. They seemed so at home there, as if their lives were directly connected to the waterfall and the rocks. So, too, he could plainly see the connection of the waterfall to the rocks and the rocks to the waterfall. Without the rocks, the waterfall could not sing, and without the waterfall, the rocks could not be worn away into the soils of the world. One could not live without the other, and suddenly he realized that all other entities of creation could not live without the rocks, the waters, and the very air. He understood then that the rocks were like the waters. The same lessons set forth by the waters were also found in the rocks and ultimately the air. At this point he could feel the rocks, the stones, and the soils of the world moving within his flesh and consciousness. He could feel the connection of these rocks to all other rocks and soils of the world, and like the waters, they were all living, thinking beings. They were no longer just spiritually alive, but physically alive. He knew then that the essence of the soil did not come to life only upon entering the plants, but was alive from the very beginning. Like the water, the rocks, the soils, and even the air dwell in their own living consciousness. Combined, they become part of the consciousness and the flesh of what is classically thought of as the living. Any rock, then, any soil, becomes a window through which all soils and rocks of the earth and sky could communicate. So, too, was he composed of rocks and air. His consciousness, then, was not his own, but a combination of rock, air, and water. He was at once connected to all things, part of all things. Through that dynamic connection, Grandfather realized that whatever was done to the soils, the rocks, waters, and the air of the world was also done to his flesh and mind. There could no longer be a separation. Man was soil, air, and water. The combination of all creates flesh. Thus the connection can never be broken, but only denied. At that moment, Grandfather felt a kinship to all things even more than he had ever had before. His flesh expanded to include all things, and he never felt so close, so alive, or so real. At this point in his life, he was so expanded that he felt the earth moving within him and himself moving within the earth. It was not just his flesh and his mind, but the mind of all flesh, of all things. And now he knew that he could communicate with all things of the earth and the sky through his own flesh, through his inner vision, which in fact was the inner vision of all things. Grandfather stayed at the waterfall for several more days, wandering around the immediate jungle and exploring the upper parts of the falls. He knew that the waterfall was done teaching him, but he was in no hurry to leave the area. He knew that it was the last time he would visit the waterfall in the flesh. He wanted to know it intimately so that it would always remain fresh in his mind. Finally, on the 7th day, he departed and headed back up to his homeland, a journey that would take him several months. He was drawn again, this time by the lure of Death Valley. A marked contrast exists between this world of water and jungle and the dry, arid expanses of the desert. There he knew that the lessons of the waterfall would be completed. To understand one, he had to also fully understand the other. Rick and I could now plainly understand why Grandfather had been so connected to water. It went beyond the sense of thanksgiving and awe. He used any water as a window to all waters. I imagine that when he touched the waters in our little camp area, he in fact was also touching the special waterfall of life in South America. It was like a fusion of consciousness where Grandfather could tap into the entire global water system by just touching the water. So too did I fully understand that to Grandfather, all water was living. It was a single organism of mind and flesh, and not just of spiritual mind as I once thought. From that day on, Rick and I always approached water as Grandfather had done, realizing for the first time that the water was living. I have always taught my students that the people of the earth believe that everything had a spirit and thus was alive. They made no distinction between plant and animal, rocks, water, air, or soil. To my students, to me, these things are living before they become flesh. We are the collective total of all the parts of earth and sky, a collective consciousness that existed long before we became living. We no longer rush to the water in an irreverent way, for we know that we are in fact going back into ourselves, back to our origins, and reuniting with our own very blood. In essence, the living waters will be here long after we have become spirit again, and the waters will still contain part of our consciousness, as will the rocks, the soils, and the very air. After all, the very earth we breathe was once breathed by the ancients, and the water that has become our blood was once the blood of all living things of the past.